Hello, and welcome to our 4-part video series on data protection in research practice. Some of you are probably wondering why you should even deal with this topic, and the answer to this question is actually quite simple. For a start, it is always good to know what is happening to your data and how it is protected. For example, when you participate in a scientific survey or a conference, or when you subscribe to a mailing list. Also, you may come to a point, maybe already during your studies, but almost certainly during your scientific career, where you have to collect data from others. For example, when you create surveys for your research, or when you organize conferences yourself. It is then particularly important that the data collection is carried out in compliance with data protection laws, not only to protect the participants, but also to protect yourself legally. This is why in the first 3 videos we will take a closer look at the General Data Protection Regulation, or in short, the GDPR. We will learn about important terms in the GDPR, the principles of the GDPR, key roles and their rights and obligations as defined in the GDPR, and the exemptions formulated in favor of science and research. In the last video, I will then introduce you to the Elder Consent Form Wizard, a practical tool for creating GDPR-compliant consent forms. But first, let us take a look at the questions that we will address in this video. In this tutorial series, we will deal with the following questions. What is the GDPR and what does it apply to? What is personal data and what is sensitive data? What does anonymization or pseudonymization of data mean? What are the principles of the GDPR? What are the key roles defined in the GDPR? And last but not least, how can data be processed for archiving purposes as well as for scientific or historical research purposes in a GDPR-compliant manner? Afterwards, I will provide you with a step-by-step tutorial and an example scenario in order to introduce you to the Elder Consent Form Wizard. This part of the series covers important terms in the GDPR. This means that today we are mainly dealing with the first 3 questions. Let's start with some basic information about the GDPR. Long before the GDPR came into force, data protection was already an important issue in the EU, and it was guaranteed as a fundamental right in the Charter of Fundamental Rights under Article 8. This article states that everyone has the right to the protection of personal data concerning him or her, that such data must be processed fairly for specified purposes and on the basis of the consent of the person concerned, or some other legitimate basis laid down by law. That everyone has the right to access the data collected concerning him or her and the right to have it rectified. And also that compliance with these rules is controlled by an independent authority. How these points were implemented in national data protection laws, however, varied greatly. With the GDPR, the legal framework for data protection has now been standardized across the EU, and guidelines for international data traffic have been created as well. As of May 25, 2018, the GDPR became a directly applicable law throughout the EU. This, by the way, is also what distinguishes a regulation from directives, which must first be implemented in the national legislations of the member states before they are binding. Regulations, on the other hand, are immediately legally binding for all member states. We have already heard that the GDPR serves the purpose of standardizing data protection regulations across the EU. But what exactly does the regulation actually apply to? Basically, the GDPR aims at the protection of personal data which is processed either by fully or partially automated or by non-automated means, and which is stored or intended to be stored in a file system. Therefore, data protection not only concerns computers and the digital domain, but also analog data. However, the GDPR does not affect data processing by natural persons for the sole purpose of performing personal or family activities. But keep in mind, the publishing of such data, for example on social media, does not count as a personal or family activity. And the GDPR also does not apply to processing by public authorities for the purposes of the prevention, investigation, detection or prosecution of criminal offenses, or the execution of criminal penalties, including the safeguarding against and the prevention of threats to public security. Also, it is important to note that the GDPR is always about data of natural persons. Data of deceased persons or legal entities like corporations, associations, and companies are not protected by the GDPR. But what does processing mean in this context? Processing within the scope of the GDPR means any operation or set of operations which is performed upon personal data, whether or not by automatic means such as collection, recording, organization, adaptation or alteration, dissemination, or any other form of making available, but also restriction, erasure, or destruction. In other words, any form of access to or handling of personal data. Which actually leads us to the next question on our agenda. What is personal data? And what is sensitive data? Let's start with personal data. Personal data is information that relates to an identified or identifiable natural person. This means that with the help of personal data, the identity of a natural person is either clearly evident or that conclusions can be drawn about the identity, for example with the help of additional information such as location data, the student identification number, or any data of physical, genetic, economic, cultural or social characteristics. And all this additional information is strictly speaking also personal data. That means that personal data does not simply refer to a person's name, address, date of birth or place of birth. It is rather all data that enables direct or indirect identification. This, for example, also includes financial data such as income or debts, location data, employer, matriculation or student identification number, marital status, email addresses, the IP address, but also eye and hair color, or photos, and much more. Sensitive data is a special form of personal data. It includes, for example, information on ethnic origin or background, political opinion, religious or ideological conviction, union membership, or on sexual orientation or health status. But sensitive data also includes information that enables clear identification, such as genetic or biometric data. Data processing of sensitive data requires special measures of protection. Processing of sensitive data is only possible if explicit consent has been obtained beforehand, if the information has already been published by the natural person themselves, or if the processing is necessary for the protection of vital interests of the person or other persons. However, since processing of both, let's call it simple personal data and sensitive data is still a sensitive issue, the GDPR also defines two forms of processing scenarios that are intended to minimize the risk: anonymization and pseudonymization. And that actually leads us right to the last question on our agenda. What does anonymization and pseudonymization of data mean? Anonymized data is data that has been modified or encrypted in such a way that the natural person concerned can no longer be identified. Anonymous or anonymized data is therefore no data protection issue. Pseudonymized data is also encrypted data, but here the identity of a natural person can be determined by adding additional information. This additional information must be stored separately and in such a way that uninvolved third parties cannot establish a connection to determine the identity of a natural person. Unlike anonymized data, pseudonymized data is still covered by data protection. And with that, we have finished all of the questions of today's video. Now let's summarize the most important points concerning the GDPR that we have learned today. The General Data Protection Regulation is, as the name suggests, a regulation, and therefore immediately legally binding for all EU member states. With the GDPR, standardized data protection arrangements have been created across the EU. The GDPR aims at data protection in the processing of personal data of living natural persons. Personal data is any data that makes it possible to identify a natural person. Sensitive data requires special measurements of protection. The GDPR also defines two forms of processing scenarios that are intended to increase data protection and to minimize risk: anonymization and pseudonymization. Anonymous or anonymized data is no data protection issue. Pseudonymized data is still a data protection issue. And that's it for the first part of the video series on data protection in research practice. In the next part, we will take a closer look at the principles of the GDPR, and we will also get to know the key roles and the rights and obligations as defined in the GDPR. If you're looking for additional information on the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights or the GDPR, you can find further material and useful links in the description below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.